Hi, I'm Mark, and we have to talk about Brexit again today. The agreement with the EU on the Northern Ireland Protocol gives British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak an important success. There is certainly criticism, but so far little resistance. Yeah, until now. British Prime Minister Sunak has done the right thing. UK MPs and the media have accepted the so-called Windsor Framework, the agreement with the EU on the Northern Ireland Protocol, if not praised it as a great success. The feared revolt of the Brexit hardliners did not materialize yet. In the lower house debate that followed the joint appearance of Sunak and EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen on Monday afternoon, no MP spoke out against the agreement. Even the leader of the Unionist Party, the DUP of Northern Ireland, Geoffrey Donaldson, withdrew to the position that the text of the treaty had to be checked first. According to negotiating circles, this will take weeks because the DUP is deeply divided internally. Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who negotiated the Northern Ireland Protocol and refused to engage in constructive negotiations with the EU for 2 years, has yet to comment. The current agreement, which the British government and the EU Commission have reached after more than 4 months of tough talks, brings considerable relief to Britain's trade with Northern Ireland. As Northern Ireland is a member of both the EU internal market and the UK internal market in goods under the Northern Ireland Protocol Treaty, its hybrid status had led to customs and border checks, which made trade across the Irish Sea difficult. Sunak and von der Leyen have now made compromises that are intended to simplify this. Strictly speaking, as this is not a renegotiating of the Northern Ireland Protocol, the British Parliament does not have to pass any new legislation. Nevertheless, Sunak announced a vote in due course when all parties have been able to examine the text of the contract. According to consistent British media reports, this could happen the week after next. And there is, of course, initial criticism, above all from the hardliner of the DUP, Sammy Wilson. The parliamentary group leader in the House of Commons warned on Tuesday that Sunak's promised veto of the so-called Stormont break was not what had been promised full-bodedly. Because since Northern Ireland has to follow numerous laws of the EU internal market, but the Northern Irish Parliament at the Stormont seat of government in Belfast has no influence whatsoever on EU legislation, a compromise has been negotiated with the so-called Stormont break. Similar to the EFTA states such as Norway, the Northern Irish Parliament will in future be able to object if EU laws in exceptionally rare cases have a lasting impact on the daily life of the Northern Irish public. The resolution of 30 MPs from 2 parties is sufficient to raise an objection, but this is then followed by extensive consultations. A veto should ultimately only come from the London government. But Wilson criticized, "That will hardly happen since London would then have to fear corresponding countermeasures from the EU." Well, the assessment is not wrong. Former Brexit negotiator David Frost also criticized the Windsor Framework for not being the revolutionary change to the Northern Ireland Protocol that Sunak was selling to the country. It does not mean that the agreement should not have been reached, but it does not change the basic situation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. It even makes it permanent, he said. Northern Ireland still has to follow EU rules and EU law, and ultimately the European Court of Justice still has a role in Northern Ireland. This assessment is not wrong either. Contrary to the demands of the DUP and the die-hard Brexit advocates, the European Court of Justice remains the authority that decides on the interpretation of EU law applicable in Northern Ireland. However, other bodies such as the Joint Dispute Resolution Committee set out in the Northern Ireland Protocol and Irish courts are involved first. What the Windsor deal shows more than anything is a British Prime Minister who engages in constructive, pragmatic and friendly negotiations with the European Commission can achieve more than the confrontational approach pursued by Johnson and his negotiator Frost. The compromise that has now allowed trade to ease, at least with Northern Ireland, is more than Johnson and Frost have achieved in 2 years. On the contrary, the aggressive negotiating style demanded by the Brexit hardliners in the Conservative group made an agreement almost impossible. Details of the negotiations were repeatedly leaked to the media, domestic political sentiment was raised against the EU, and the EU was threatened with a breach of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. Trust in the London contracting party had fallen to 0.0%, said EU negotiators. But even now, columnists in right-wing media such as the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail lament that the tough approach might have yielded even more in the end. Johnson had no other choice. The EU, and especially the EU supporters in Parliament, had undermined his negotiating position so much. Otherwise, Brexit would not have happened at all. Oh God, those two are delusional. The fact that Johnson is currently not showing anything and how much that shows how much the situation has changed. Sunak, his Foreign Secretary James Cleverly, and Northern Ireland Secretary Chris Heaton-Harris have been rewarded with important concessions for the confidential and solution-oriented negotiations. Apart from Northern Ireland, no country will be allowed to import goods that do not follow EU production standards, which now accept this, at least for goods imported by the UK, to remain in Northern Ireland. Numerous other regulations go further than is normally the case for the EU, just to protect the peace. And not only that, as soon as Parliament has approved the Windsor framework and it is implemented, the UK's admission to the EU research programme Horizon Europe will begin in Brussels. Integration into the EU Earth observation programme Copernicus, which the British plan to leave but which they now want to rejoin, is also to follow in the near future. A connection to the EU-funded program of the CERN particle accelerator is also under discussion. Closer cooperation, for example, in energy policy is another point. From London's point of view, the Windsor framework also makes the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, launched by the Johnson government, superfluous. It would have enabled the Northern Ireland Protocol to be unilaterally overturned and is now being taken off the table, which is good because that would have broken international law. And with a view to Northern Ireland, Sunak has been clever in his tactics. Since the Northern Irish Parliament or Assembly can only object to EU law once a government has been formed in Belfast, the DUP's blocking policy does not pay off in the long run. They are blocking the formation of a government in protest at the Northern Ireland Protocol, but also because they would have to submit to the new, stronger Sinn Féin in Parliament after the recent election. However, since the House of Commons vote on the Windsor framework is scheduled to take place the week after next, the Brexit hardliners in the Conservative faction cannot wait for the DUP's decision. Some of these hardliners have already given in and signalled that they are behind Sunak. With Labour planning to vote for the deal anyway, Sunak is likely to see an overwhelming majority in the vote. The DUP would be isolated, and giving in to the pressure of the Unionists of Northern Ireland and perhaps agreeing to the formation of a government in early summer would be significant. Even if Sunak doesn't manage to do that, he has achieved an important goal. With the now improved relationship with the EU and the accommodation from Brussels, he has taken the opposition's vulnerability away. Opposition leader Keir Starmer had positioned Labour to exploit the Tory party's anti-EU sentiment and Brexit malaise in the next election in 2024. With the slogan "Make Brexit Work," he wanted to collect all the votes from voters who were frustrated with Brexit and the incompetence of the Tories and longed for a better relationship with the EU and, of course, solutions. Whether Sunak will emerge from the deep hole of the bad election polls is more than questionable still, but at least he found the right approach. In the House of Commons, he stressed to MPs that the UK had actually regained control with this agreement, a formulation alluding to the campaign slogan "Take Back Control," which was once used to promote Brexit. Sunak also announced that thanks to the current agreement, there is no longer the feeling of a border in the Irish Sea. However, experts and lawyers have been bending over the text since Monday, and it is becoming increasingly clear that reality is more multifaceted than Sunak is representing it. The agreement is a compromise that, as expected, also bears the signature of the EU. It is striking that key aspects of the agreement are currently being interpreted quite differently. In order to facilitate trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, there will be green lanes and red lanes when handling goods transport. Transports that go via Northern Ireland to the Republic of Ireland and thus into the EU market are still subject to all existing customs and checking regulations. That means they take the red lane. On the other hand, there are considerable simplifications for goods transports that remain in Northern Ireland. That means they take the green lane, provided the traders are registered as trusted traders. That the impression of a border in the Irish Sea will thus disappear, as Prime Minister Sunak suggests, is not entirely true, because customs declarations will still be required for the green lane and there will still be checks, both of which, however, are to a much lesser extent than before. In return, the EU receives access to IT systems with which the movement of goods can be checked. If Great Britain refuses this access, the EU can repeal the green lanes. And there should also be improvements in the offer in Northern Ireland. So far, only food and medicines that meet EU standards have been allowed to be brought into Northern Ireland or produced and sold there. In the future, the Northern Irish population should be able to receive the same products as the British in other parts of the country. Among other things, this will allow the sale of medicines that have been approved by the British, but not by the EU Medicines Authority. In the future, for example, trading in seed potatoes and fresh meat products should also be possible, so there Sunak is telling the truth. The so-called sausage war is thus considered over. However, some food products must be labeled as not intended for the EU. There will also be simplifications for parcel shipping for private households and companies, and anyone who wants to take their pet to Northern Ireland will no longer need special vaccinations and certificates for the animal in the future, provided it has a microchip. For the Brexit hardliners and the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, which has been blocking the formation of a regional government in Northern Ireland for months, it is of crucial importance whether and to what extent Northern Ireland is still subject to what they call EU dictates. The DUP complains about a democratic deficit because EU laws are valid in Northern Ireland, but Northern Ireland has no say. That is now to change with the so-called Stormont break. Accordingly, the regional parliament in Stormont and Belfast can slow down new EU regulations if they have serious effects on the everyday life of Northern Ireland. The British government, as I said earlier, then can veto it, and a joint committee, a body made up of representatives from Great Britain and the EU, would then have to work out a solution. With the Stormont break, the reading is different. According to Prime Minister Sunak, it will restore popular and institutional sovereignty to Northern Ireland. The mechanism is sometimes celebrated as giving Northern Ireland a fundamental say. On the other hand, the EU side apparently wants it to be understood more as an emergency solution for exceptional cases. There is also a need for clarification with regard to the future and the future role of the European Court of Justice. On the British side, it's emphasized that the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice for Northern Ireland has been severely curtailed. 1,700 pages of EU legislation on VAT, medicines and food safety have been deleted, they say, which also means that the court's jurisdiction in these areas is lost. Well, as a result of the new agreement, not even 3% of the EU regulations would apply in Northern Ireland in the future. At the moment, however, there are still many unanswered questions related to this passage. The Windsor framework is currently being legally examined by various parties. Prime Minister Sunak has announced, as I said, a vote in the House of Commons on the agreement, but has left the timing open, although we always hear it's the week after the next. But it's also not yet known whether a parliamentary vote would only be a matter of political approval or whether legislative changes will be necessary. Prime Minister Sunak would certainly have the necessary majority in the House of Commons. As I mentioned earlier, the Labour Party has already announced that it will vote in favour of the agreement. However, failing to secure a majority of his own with his Conservative Party would again weaken Sunak's position. The hope is that they will accept the agreement and agree to form a government, which they have so far refused to do from the side of the DUP, I mean. However, it's unclear how long the DUP will examine the Windsor framework and when they intend to announce their decision. For their part, the DUP has already made it clear that it intends to take the necessary time to examine the agreement. According to experts, this could take a week or two, and DUP boss Sir Geoffrey Donaldson even made it clear that it takes as long as it takes. The Prime Minister wants the Unionists' approval, but there have also been hints that the deal could go through without their support. Speaking to BBC Radio 4, the PM has given a potentially telltale response. When asked if the plan would go ahead without the support of the DUP, Sunak said, "The framework is what we have agreed with the European Union." In any case, one thing is clear. The process leading up to the implementation of new regulations will take a long time, even if the critical parts of the Tories and the DUP should support the project. New legislation is probably needed on both sides of the treaty, and that could take months. Although the Unionists only have 8 MPs in the British House of Commons, possible opposition would primarily affect the regional parliament of Northern Ireland. And they would endure even longer what they've done in months by not having a government. And even with Sunak's deal, Northern Ireland remains a de facto part of the EU's internal market, much to the displeasure of Unionists. Sunak is trying to convince them, among other things, with the Stormont break, because they just don't want to understand that the situation is just great for Northern Ireland. The Northern Ireland Protocol stipulates that the customs border between the UK and the EU is in the Irish Sea. Land borders on the island of Ireland are to remain open to avoid border checks between Ireland and the north of the Emerald Isle. Open borders are particularly important to the nationalist population. And meanwhile, the Northern Irish Unionists feel cut off from Great Britain by the customs and import checks and see the difficulties in domestic British trade. Whether Sunak can win them over to his agreement remains open, at least for the time being. But it remains that we have a lot of days to come to talk about Brexit and the Windsor framework. So if the vote is in 1 or 2 weeks, well, at least until then, we will have a lot to discuss about the Windsor framework. And I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.